welcome to an Everyday Canines video. We're on the Running Contact series, and before we get right into the foundations of training, I want to talk about one last thing which is very important, and it can be a thing that makes or breaks your contacts. And what I want to talk to you about is edges. Now, my dog walk is a wooden dog walk. It has no slant on the end of its base, so it's a square. It's just a plank of wood at the end. In the old days, I used to have it sitting up off the ground, so effectively there was a step off the dog walk. These days I've dug it in the ground, so if you came over and saw, there is nothing. It literally just is one smooth plank. Now that is important because when we're asking our dogs to run down, often when they're hitting really low, if they're getting all four paws in, they hit here and they may even hit with one foot slightly off. What can happen if there's an edge here, a step or what have you, as the dog is putting its foot off to do the beautiful running contact you've trained, it hurts its paw because it's gone on an edge. Or it steps off sharply and it jars itself. And what can happen, and I had it with Sparrow, and I didn't realise at the time, and then I had it with Swift, is that they learn there's a step, so to prevent themselves hitting it with the paw, they start to jump off early. And when I was originally training Sparrow to do running contacts, I had this plank flat on the ground, no thought about that well, so obviously it had a huge step at the end, and so she'd get a lovely contact, but then her foot would go off it, and then I'd get leaping. And it took me a while to realise that what was actually happening was the edge. So now, whenever I'm training, the dog walk is dug in the ground, so it's just one smooth edge. And if I use a plank on the ground, I am very cautious about that too. Even thin plank boards, like they call the contact trainers, I've got one of those, it's just a board. But even they've got an edge. And if you imagine you were running over it with your foot, if you hit it wrong on that edge, it's going to hurt. And that's going to stop that. So whenever you're doing these things and you're training any form of contacts where it's just flat on the ground, flat work, or like this, think about that edge and either dig your dog walk in or build sand up around it or do something to remove that edge. Most up-to-date training clubs will have dog walks which either have a slope cut into the base so that they almost sit perfect to the ground, or they will do something to make sure their dog walk is in the ground, there isn't an edge. Occasionally, of course, you might get clubs who perhaps they're not so competition based, they don't realise these things, or they don't do a lot of running contacts, and you might find you at an edge. If that's your only dog walk you have access to, I would suggest you might have to consider what you're training as a running contact. You either have a choice. You either train the dog to hit higher to avoid that step altogether, which is going to be quite tricky, or you might even have to consider stop contacts if that's your only access to a dog walk is one that has an edge and is a prominent edge. I'm not talking about a little tiny one, even though personally I like no edge at all. So this is absolutely nothing. I don't even like, but if it's a big solid edge, I mean this used to be like that. You just got to think about it. You've got to think your dog is effectively walking off a step. And that is going to change the way they run down, and it's going to interfere with creating consistent, reliable running dog walks perfectly, for the perfect reason that simply the dog is going to hurt itself from time to time on this edge, and the dog is going to go, I don't like doing that. And the other thing you've got to bear in mind is there is also the potential for a toe or paw injury if they do come off it wrong. So that's something I just want to mention before we move on, is always think about your edges. That also bears in mind, now my dog walk is on full height, and these days I always train on full height from the get-go. I don't tend to do lowered, though I can do lowered. Obviously when you lower the dog walk, then you get an edge again, because I'd either have to dig this further in the ground, which I have done in the past, or if you've got one that's these dog walks, the new ones, which have got a slope cut into them, that only works when they're on full height. As you lower them, the end comes up and they start to have a step again. So this can now interfere with your dog walk, running contact skills, because you're now creating an edge. These days I don't actually borrow lowered equipment. I go straight in from this height. It's not as tall as it used to be, And when I first start, I'm not actually using the top plank that much, so I don't actually worry that much. I'm just concentrating on here. So I don't actually bother with lowered these days. But if you do have a lowered or your club goes lowered, be aware of that edge, and you need to either adjust it, put something like foam under, or make a little extra ramp. Just do something to make sure you're eliminating that edge right from the get-go, so you're not damaging your running contacts before you even get going. So that's my little word of warning, and then we're going to go on in the next videos to actually training running contacts. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's been informative. And if you have, you might like to subscribe to us on YouTube. Click the bell button to get notifications of new videos. And you can also check us out on Facebook and Instagram. And I hope to see you all again very, very soon.